let's start. Welcome everyone to this PhD defense. I'm Simon Bolby, I'm the chairperson here today, and I'm also a senior researcher at DTU Management Engineering. I'm leading the climate group and also acting head of division of our systems analysis. We have here today our PhD candidate, of course, Zyaad Boodoo. We have the examiners, Dirk Loorbach from the Netherlands, the Dutch Research Institution for Transition, and the university is Erasmus University. We have Arne Remmen, Department of Development and Planning, Aalborg University. And we have Ivan Nygaard from our own DTU Management Engineering, the UNEP DTU partnership. Welcome to you. Welcome to you, the audience. And then I will just tell you what's going to happen. First, we'll have the presentation from Zyaad, 45 minutes, plus minus. And we'll have a bio break, a coffee break. And then Zyaad will be subjected to the questioning, will be put to the question by the committee here. And that can take a maximum of 2 hours in total. But let's hope they can do it a little quicker. And if any of you in the audience would like to ask questions to Zyaad, you have to come and tell me in the break. So we are a little warned of that. So the title of the defense is Donor Support for Sustainability Transition, the Case of Low Carbon Development in the Cement Sector of Tunisia. So you can all hear it's a very important topic that we are going to hear something about today. And I think that's all for the introduction. Yeah, and I'll give the floor to you.
Well, thank you, Chair, and good afternoon to you all, and thank you for being here today for my PhD defense. And the title of my presentation will be Donor Support for Sustainability Transition, the Case of Low Carbon Development in the Cement Sector of Tunisia. I am Zyaad Boodoo, and I'm a PhD student at the UNEP DTU Partnership. Well, I will briefly introduce the structure of my presentation today. I will start with a short background to on the rationale for undertaking this piece of research, followed by the way my thesis has been structured. I will then briefly introduce the research questions I have addressed, followed by the theoretical frameworks upon which my thesis is based upon. A short overview of critical studies and on the empirical case will then follow. I will then detail the methodology I've adopted to address the research questions, and then the gist of my presentation will be on the critical findings I've found from the 3 articles that comprise my thesis. I will then detail the cross-cutting findings, empirical findings, followed by some theoretical reflections on using theoretical concepts from the transition literature. Well, a short background to the piece of research. In view of the growing contributions of developing countries to global emissions of greenhouse gases, how such countries transition to a low-carbon development pathway is of crucial importance. And at the Paris Summit in 2005, developed nations have confirmed their intention to disperse around $100 billion of climate funding every year. And aid and donors have been identified as a key channel through which these kinds of funds will be transferred. And more recently, eminent climate funding institutions have been adopting terms such as transformational change and paradigm shifts within their jargon. And this is an indication of the importance of addressing climate mitigation across the world in itself. However, there's still limited academic coverage that address the specific role of development aid in transitions in developing countries. And my thesis aims to contribute to these debates by applying concepts and frameworks from the literature on sustainability transitions to this topic. Well, the thesis comprises of a synopsis and 3 articles, which all have been co-authored as depicted on the table below. Informed by the literature on transition management, the first paper analyzes whether traditional planning methodologies prevalent within the donor community foster transitions. This paper has been published in Climate and Development and has been co-authored with Mersman and Olsen. The second article uses concepts from the MLP to analyze how donors have influenced transitions across the Tunisian cement sector within a 25-year period from 1990 to 2015. This article is written in co-authorship with Hansen and is currently under review by Technological Forecasting and Social Change. And the final paper uses insights from both the MLP and transition management to assess the potential for a Tunisian cement NAMA developed between 2012 and 2013 to incur significant changes towards a low-carbon development pathway. The article has been published late 2017 in Climate Policy and in co-authorship with Olsen. Well, the overall research question addressed by this thesis is how do external donor interventions influence sustainability transition to low-carbon development in the case of cement production in Tunisia? And this overall research question is addressed through 3 sub-research questions. The first one being addresses to what extent are currently large LFA-based management approaches of climate finance able to capture characteristics of transformational change processes set out by the literature on transition management, and consequently, how can such approaches be improved? Well, it's a rather long research question, but it's basically, the article compares a donor planning methodology that has been present over decades, that is the logical framework approach, with the methodology enshrined within that of transition management. And the second sub-research questions addresses how externally supported niches in the Tunisian cement industry have developed and why they did not develop into viable ones. Well, in Tunisia, there's a number of donors such as the German Development Agency, GIZ, UNDP, and the European Union, and others, which have engaged in a series of interventions that address directly or indirectly the cement sector. And those measures have had limited impacts as to date. And it is just interesting to understand the reasons accounting for such a situation. And the third research question, sub-research question, addresses how and to what extent does the Tunisian cement NAMA promote transformational change to low-carbon development in Tunisia. It is to be noted that at research design stage, this particular NAMA was being branded across climate circles as a very comprehensive one. And this triggers interest into investigating really whether the NAMA can actually bring a significant change to the cement sector. Well, now, in order to address the research questions, I have made use of 2 theoretical frameworks, namely the MLP and transition management. And firstly, within the MLP, I have used the concepts of niches, regimes, and landscapes, as well as I have analyzed the interactions between these 3 concepts. Well, niches are basically protected spaces that allow for new socio-technical configurations and practices to emerge and transfer of technology to take place. Well, regimes are basically sources of stability that provide the dominant way in which societal functions are fulfilled. And due to a series of stabilizing mechanisms, regimes are characterized by path dependency, structural lock-in, and resistance to change. Landscapes are basically external factors to influencing regimes and niches. And in essence, the MLP suggests that under certain conditions, niches can compete with and possibly dominate regimes. This requires a situation of relative instability at regime level, which can be brought about under the combined pressures of niches and landscape level factors. While the MLP was useful to address one of the research questions posed by this thesis, further theoretical insight was required for the remaining ones. This was addressed through making use of concepts from the transition management literature, such as transition arenas and the arenas activities at different governance activity levels. Whilst within transition management, steering of niche development is entrusted to a so-called transition arena, which in a sense is both an institutional arrangement of carefully chosen change agents and a methodology whereby different perspectives, expectations, and agendas are confronted, discussed, and aligned. Well, transition management basically suggests that the transition arena can enable a shift in ideologies and belief systems by allowing participants to operate outside normal policy cycles. Well, after this brief presentation of key concepts used, I will now move on to the critical studies my thesis speaks to. Well, the thesis uses theories of sustainability transitions to study the role of development aid in promoting low-carbon transitions. This body of literature is a rapidly growing area, with around 60 to 100 new articles being published annually, according to a survey by Marquardt and others in 2012. Those theories focus on far-reaching transformational processes by explicitly incorporating the socio-technical, the socio-institutional, and socio-ecological aspects of transitions to sustainable development. Popular frameworks used by researchers engaged in this field include the two frameworks I've used, that is the MLP and transition management, as well as strategic niche management and technological innovation systems. And within this field, there has been an emerging debate focusing on transitions in developing countries. Wigzorek identified at least 115 papers that have been published between 2005 and 2016, that is over an 11-year period on this topic. And zooming further into this subfield of transitions in developing countries, in nascent literature focusing explicitly on donor aid and sustainability transitions has been growing. This body of research is still at an embryonic stage of development, with only around 8 publications on this topic to date. And naturally, the scope for further development is wide, and this thesis mainly speaks to this literature. For example, the 3 articles prepared address a gap in the sectoral coverage through analysis of an energy-intensive manufacturing industry. They also address a gap in the literature by empirically analyzing what planned interventions to promote transitions through NAMAs mean in practice. Finally, the articles also examine whether the design of donor interventions tackles systemic features of lock-in. Well, I will now detail the methodology I have adopted in order to answer the research questions posed. Well, data collection. The research draws from a case study with primary data collection spread over 2 phases. In a first instance, a 2-week pre-field trip was undertaken in May of 2014 in Tunis, whereby initial contact was made with key actors in the Tunisian cement sector. A longer 8-week field trip was then held in 2 cities in Tunisia, the capital, Tunis, and Ariana, which was held here. In total, 20 actors were from cement firms, trade unions, government agencies, and donor organizations who were interviewed, as well as 3 workshops related to NAMAs, to carbon markets, and technology needs assessments were attended within this data collection phase. These interviews lasted from 40 minutes to 3 hours and were digitally recorded when permission was granted, with remaining interviews being documented through extensive field notes, so as to enable respondents to express themselves more clearly. Used French while conducting interviews, with the interview data being then translated and transcribed for further analysis. And secondary data was sourced from academic articles, industry and government reports, published statistics, as well as donor evaluation reports. In order to operationalize transition concepts analyzed in this thesis, such as in the case of niche concept, interviews were asked to elaborate on their involvement or knowledge of specific local initiatives with the potential to significantly reduce carbon emissions from cement production. And regimes were examined during interviews by asking questions regarding the main organizations, physical infrastructures, formal rules, regulations, dominant actors, and technologies related to cement production. To operationalize the landscape concept, interviews asked the various external factors influencing the sector. And furthermore, to understand niche dynamics specifically, interviewees were asked to describe the main driving and impeding factors underlying the development of those niches. The transition arena was conceptualized as a platform through which the various interests of previously loosely connected group of concerned actors could be discussed around a common objective And in this case, it was conceptualized as the cement NAMA. And to operationalize transition management's governance activity levels, interviewees were prompted to detail their involvement and experience with the formulation of the NAMA. For example, to operationalize strategic activities, probing questions address how the NAMA was organized, governed, managed, and including the methodologies that were followed. Well, a number of analytical and field procedures were followed to ensure further validity and reliability of findings that involve moving back and forth between the empirical data and concepts used, undertaking triangulation of data sources and keeping a case study database, and following meticulous interpretation of excerpts from interview data and triangulation with documentation collected. Narratives were subsequently constructed on the role of donor interventions within low-carbon transitions across the Tunisian cement sector. Prior to describing the Tunisian cement sector, it is worth noting that the cement industry is in itself a notoriously polluting industry globally, and which has an inherently high carbon intensity due to its high energy requirements for production, as well as due to release of carbon dioxide from its chemical processes. Furthermore, this industry is characterized by other stabilizing features that further enhance its lock-in into a high carbon pathway. These comprise of an aversion to risky investments, a lack of viable alternatives, the influence of a political industrial complex of cement production, and uniformity of cement products. Well, the Tunisian cement industry is no exception. As you can see on the graph, cement production in Tunisia has increased over time, leading to an increase in emissions of greenhouse gases, depicted in the bottom graph. While it is true that the graph shows an increase in emissions that seem to naturally follow an increase in production, however, the relative emissions on a per ton of cement produce have also increased by around 30% between 2003 and 2012. And this indicates that the sector is getting increasingly carbon lock-in. And this is despite a number of measures to green the sector over time. Well, in addition, a number of factors make the cement industry an interesting case to study from a transition perspective. Comprised of 9 factory units belonging to 8 different groups. It is a carbon-intensive industry with a long history in the country dating back to 1930s. And it experienced major changes, such as a wave of privatization between 1998 and 2005, and depletion of fossil fuels at national level. Well, these factors make it interesting to study from a transition perspective. And the choice of Tunisia emerged from an original search for African countries with the most advanced NAMAs to attend to an original focus of the thesis. And at research design stage, and with 6 NAMAs under preparation at that time, Tunisia came out as an interesting case, with the cement NAMA being the most mature one. Well, following this description of the background context, I'll now move to the main part of my presentation, that is the key findings obtained. Well, the first paper investigates whether traditional donor planning interventions foster transformations and how such approaches can be improved. On the one hand, we have this long-standing planning model within the development community, that is the logical framework approach. On the other hand, we have this rather new method designed to steer transitions to sustainable development, and which has been devised in the Netherlands. What I did was to compare the two, the theoretical basis between both management approaches, to see whether the LFA can actually address transformational change processes. To that end, I have analyzed the guiding documents of 2 prominent climate funding bodies, that is the Green Climate Fund and the NAMA Facility. And what I've found is that they have adopted a mix of logical framework approaches and theories of change, especially within the NAMA Facility. In a sense, theories of change are based on the same family of theories, namely program theory, and are essentially an LFM-based model with longer causality trains. Well, this paper addresses 2 knowledge gaps. In the first instance, an empirical one pertaining to the current state of confusion regarding operationalizing transformational change within key climate funds, and a concurrent gap in the transition management literature by applying its theoretical perspectives to a new setting, namely the funding of NAMAs in developing countries. Well, the key results from this process indicates a fundamental difference between the 2 approaches. On the one hand, the LFA approaches envisage change processes as being linear with predictable cause and effect relationships. On the other hand, the transition management approach envisages change processes as being inherently complex with multiple causality and feedback loops. What this difference in conceptualization of change entails is that the inherent rigidity and fundamental assumptions of foresight and authoritative control within the LFA limits its ability to capture complex change processes involving transitions. Managing such processes is more difficult than just a simple linear kind of thinking, whereby steering of transitions can only be partly undertaken and requiring modifications over the course of implementation based on information collected. By integrating the LFA thinking in both planning and evaluation of climate interventions, both the Green Climate Fund and NAMA facility run the risk of hindering learning and adaptation within their interventions. And according to the theory, such characteristics are likely to favor system optimization instead of also promoting the required system innovation to sustain transitions. Now, this paper makes two main contributions. In the first instance, the findings obtained lead to some reflections for practitioners seeking to operationalize and implement transformational processes better. This is particularly relevant in managing transitions through nationally determined contributions from parties to the Paris Agreement. To that end, the paper suggests the integration of more reflexive and adaptive elements within NDC planning and implementation. Furthermore, it advocates that transitions involve experimentation, whereby policy design can be viewed as a process of discovery for all the actors involved. And lastly, how to contextualize the steering of transitions via transition management methodologies and principles beyond developed country contexts is an area of research that needs further investigation. For example, in this case, we identified donor accountability concerns as potentially problematic with reflexive elements, when reflective elements have to be introduced at planning and implementation stage. Those are areas for further research. Within the second article of this thesis, we have used the MLP to study how donor interventions influence the development of 4 niches of relevance to the Tunisian cement sector. Those niches comprise of an energy efficiency niche, a wind energy niche, a refuse-derived fuel niche, and an olive pomace niche. We have then constructed a narrative on the interactions of those niches with landscape and regime factors. And what we have found in this paper is that all those niches experience a relative period of momentum, influenced by complex interplay between technical, economic, social, and political factors. Out of those factors, donor interventions played a key role. Donors engage in promotional activities such as the creation of knowledge platforms. These activities have contributed to raising expectations of niche actors, and donors also provided cement companies with co-financing for specific projects. The paper further revealed that the development of those niches were erratic and expanding and contracting depending on contextual conditions. Their development were halted before creating a significant impact, with most niches not even manifesting tangibly. And further analysis revealed 4 main inhibiting factors. Firstly, the crash of carbon prices prompted cement companies to reassess their interests in investing in CDM-related projects. Secondly, the rise of an export market for olive pomace considerably reduced the ability of firms to secure long-term biomass fuel supply contracts. Thirdly, the long-standing opposition of the National Electric Utility Company to allow IPPs to sell electricity through the national grid has resulted in prolonged project approval processes. As a result, cement companies did not proceed with the development of previously planned wind farms. And fourth, the prevailing waste regimes in Tunisia is entrenched in landfilling practices, which is characterized by long-standing conflicts among actors and agencies involved. Well, in conclusion, the paper suggests that donors do encourage niche development, but they are limited by context-specific factors which are not as easily predictable. These are further enhanced through the short time frame of donor interventions, the limited the decision-making authority, as well as the often uncoordinated nature of successive interventions. This paper contributes to the literature by providing a detailed understanding on the role and limitations of donors as a key landscape factor involved in niche development. It also suggests that, in contrast with mainstream belief in the MLP literature, landscape factors may have a more direct influence on niche development. These results also point to some reflections for development practitioners and donor agencies, especially regarding the levels of ambition and expectations of various programs that will be implemented following the Paris Agreement. Well, the third article that comprises thesis focuses on the means and extent to which a donor-supported CIMAT-NAMA intervention promotes transitions to low-carbon development. And to address this research question, we have used concepts from both the MLP and transition management. What we did is to assess whether NAMA addresses factors accounting for lock-in within the cement sector. Those regime-level factors were obtained from the previous paper. What we have found from the analysis undertaken is that the Tunisian CIMAT-NAMA does possess a series of design elements that promotes a low-carbon transition of the sector. These include the establishment of a transition arena, problem structuring, coalition building, and some evaluation elements, and plan consultations. Notwithstanding those positive elements, the article also identified a number of key barriers. In the first instance, we have found that key change agents may have been missed, and formal commitments have not been secured during design stage. For example, finance actors were not involved despite having plans to secure 970 million euros from the private sector and donors. This means that perspective of crucial actors on how to operationalize pathways have been overlooked, and the NAMA's action plan has been built around the premise that conflictual issues will be sorted out somehow in a very short period. Such strategies fail to consider potential countervailing strategies of regime actors, such as the electric utility company in this particular case. And secondly, the analysis of the CIMAT-NAMA suggests that it is based on inadequate methodologies and coordination approaches, whereby the transition agenda was deliberately appropriated by industry incumbents, thereby running against fundamental principles of transition management. Finally, the CIMAT-NAMA's evaluation mechanisms, or MRV as is most commonly referred to within the climate community, is essentially oriented towards the realization of predetermined emission reduction targets for each niche detailed in the NAMA action plan. And such a narrow conceptualization of the impacts of a plan intervention misses the importance of built-in learning for transitions and contrast with the adaptive exploration of development paths of transition management. Based on the results of this paper, it is observed that the Tunisian CIMAT-NAMA is not likely to induce transformational change since underlying factors accounting for carbon lock-in have not been properly addressed. At best, the NAMA is likely to favor system improvement measures, that is, incremental adjustments that optimize a given system, instead of also incurring the required system innovation to promote a transition of the cement sector. The paper makes an empirical contribution to the NAMA literature, which had little coverage to date. It also makes a conceptual contribution through an analytical framework that can be used to study donor interventions for low-carbon transitions. Furthermore, these findings also point to a need for donors to engage into out-of-the-box thinking, as well as for them to undertake a critical reflection of their modalities. Well, during the final part of my presentation, I will now get back to my overall research question to present the empirical conclusions of this thesis, followed by some theoretical reflections when applying transition theories to developing country contexts. Well, on the one hand, what we see is that donors do have a positive influence in nurturing low-carbon transitions. Through their interventions, donors address a number of limitations in developing countries, such as, in this case, a lack of local expertise, of coordinated actions, and funding. Furthermore, donors also compel project developers to think rationally and structure project formulation through imposing the LFA as essential features of access to climate finance. As a result, local actors have been able to address climate mitigation measures in a more coordinated and synergistic way. This had led to a number of niches to emerge and expectations to grow. Research findings confirm that international support agencies do play an important role in transitions, whether as policy entrepreneurs or by providing support for niche development. However, the findings of this thesis also pinpoint to the limitations of donor interventions, which leads to the main contribution of this research. Well, as illustrated in the table, this PhD provides for refined understandings to existing findings from the literature regarding the limitations of donor approaches for low-carbon transitions. In the first instance, the research shows that the deferral of hard decisions and absence of local financiers limit the credibility of action plans devised. Secondly, the research provides for points towards the relative inadequacy of donor interventions to address local political processes and actor interests. Finally, the research also indicates that the short-term nature and uncoordinated action between donors limit their influence, such as, in their current form, such interventions cannot mobilize enough momentum to overcome regime resistance and lock-in. Well, on top of these refined understandings to findings from scholars, this thesis reveals two additional factors that constrain donor efforts to sustain transitions. Well, in the first instance, the thesis suggests that while the LFA play a crucial role as planning tools in development aid, their use as analytical tools to examine the complex relations within transitions is problematic. Inherent assumptions of foresight and control that are prevalent within the LFA diverge from the understanding from the transition literature that changes are typically difficult to predict. And secondly, this research highlights the lack of consideration given to experimentation and feedback loops within the funding modalities of key climate funds, as well as in donor programs implemented across the Tunisian cement sector. This limited integration of social learning ignores the mutual dependencies between the plan implementation processes and expected outcomes. Such findings are especially relevant within the current context of climate goals set within the Paris Agreement. Given that signatory countries are now moving to the implementation phase of NDCs, donors need to reflect critically on their ambition levels and their modalities. The final part of my presentation will be on some theoretical reflections made from the analysis undertaken. Firstly, this research has conceptualized donor interventions as a landscape factor that brings in a flow of ideas and funding external to a local context. In so doing, the landscape factor has been observed as exerting destabilizing pressures both on niche and regime dynamics, which contrasts with the existing literature whereby the impact of landscapes on niches are considered as more diffuse. While critics of the MLP framework have stressed that the landscape concept is elusive and ill-defined and is often used as a residual category in empirical research to describe the broad context or background for regimes and niches. Given that the landscape factor does not comprise an independent focus on most MLP-based studies, this thesis suggests further research on landscape factors as a topic in its own right. Secondly, this study has empirically illustrated that within developing countries, regimes tend to be more fluid as compared to the well-ordered democracies from which transition theories originate. For instance, the dynamics of niche development across a waste management regime in Tunisia has shown that an excessively unstable regime can also inhibit transitions. Hence, further research is required on regime instability. Well, the work also undertaken also illustrates the complexity of social relationships amongst actors in developing countries. Given the ambition for donor interventions to incur transitions to low-carbon development and the scarcity of articles on this topic, further research is thus required on these particular political circumstances of donor-driven transitions, as well as on their policy entrepreneurial role. Thirdly, this research has highlighted the multi-regime nature of developing country contexts. with an energy and a waste management regime being identified in the case of the Tunisian cement sector. Given the scarcity of papers that address multi-regime interactions, further research on this topic is also needed. Fourthly, this PhD has shown that the niches within the Tunisian cement sector have been limited to a very early stage of development. Verbon, Wixorek, and others have depicted such cases as niche-level experiments. Given that parties to the Paris Agreement have rapidly devised a series of new mitigation measures under conditions of donor support being provided, this finding can be reasonably expected to occur across NDC implementation. Studies on the operationalization of NDC pledges may thus need to be built on loosely connected socio-technical configurations rather than fully materialized niches. This suggests further studies into early niche formulation processes and their theoretical conceptualization within transition studies. Fifth, this research has also shown the usefulness of transition management to understand how existing donor governance paradigms influence low-carbon transitions. Lessons learned across this research suggest that donor approaches may be complemented with transition management principles of selective participation of frontrunners who are agents who are able to question deep existing structures and operate outside traditional policy circles and resist transition agenda capture. Furthermore, donors could also consider complementing the current rigid, short-term, project-based approaches towards planning interventions in developing countries with a more exploratory, long-term one based on reflexive evaluation elements. Lastly, this study has empirically shown that niches in developing country contexts are located at a further distance from regime. For example, prior to the formulation of the cement NAMA, there were no coordinated efforts to address the emissions of the cement sector synergistically. This situation prompted coordination agencies to take extra care to avoid the exit of participants through direct confrontation, which also suggests that the creation of a transition arena may be more complex in developing country contexts. And given that transition management is a relatively novel approach requiring further methodological development, further research on how to operationalize transition arenas and broader transition management principles within developing country contexts is thus required. Well, with these words, this brings me to the end of my presentation, and thank you for your attention.